So thank you so much for welcoming me. This is my favorite topic. It was my life for 10 years through graduate school, so I've got too much to say on the topic. So bear with me if I go on and on about the benefits of mindfulness. So I'm going to try and just introduce, I was amazed at how many hands went up when we were asked how many people practice mindfulness. And that's where I would also put out a caution. It's become a huge buzzword and a thing right now. And mindfulness at its core, it's just a way of being in the world. It's a basic human quality that we all possess. It's nothing fancy or amazing. It's just a part of being a human. So it's nothing, I don't want it to become too much of a fad because it's not a fad. It's just a way of life. It's just a way of being in the world. We're going to talk a little bit today about a little bit of research findings, but hopefully the focus will be more on your practical everyday experiences and what you can do to live mindfully on a day-to-day basis. So I wrote that poem, Raining Quite Hard Now, More Than I Expected Falls, Dancing Between Raindrops. I think this is kind of my way of thinking about life. Life is never always sunshine and rainbows. There's often heavy rain. And obviously, a tumor diagnosis is a heavy rain. And our job, I think, in terms of quality of life and well-being, is to figure out how to dance in between those heavy raindrops. Because the raindrops are going to fall for all of us. They might be falling heavier at certain times for other people. So there's a picture of my gorgeous family. I'm an occupational therapist. I worked on a neuro unit for about 15 years. So I worked with a lot of different people who have had various types of brain conditions, including brain tumors. And then I found myself kind of on the other side of the fence, like I think you had a presentation this morning about. I was in a car accident in 2001. And that's always an interesting experience to go from being a patient or from a care provider to a patient. And you kind of see the world in a totally different way. So my recovery, to be honest with you, it's still ongoing 17 years later, 16 years later. But at that time, what I really discovered was that I was making my situation way worse. There was a lot of negative thinking, what my mom calls stinking thinking, where this is never going to get better, I'm in so much pain, I'm never going to be able to think clearly again. And do you think that helped me? Not really. What did end up helping me was somebody introduced me to mindfulness. And so for the last 16 years, it's kind of been my way of being in the world, or what I hope is my way of being in the world. And then I started introducing it. It took me a few years, actually, because mindfulness wasn't a buzzword 15, 16 years ago. And it took me a while to bring it to the patients that I was working with, but I started to notice that I'm not the only one that benefits from this. And I really started to get some encouraging feedback from the people that I was working with that were coping with what I call those really heavy raindrops. So then I decided to go back to graduate school, and I did both my master's degree and my PhD on reflective practice, which is essentially what mindfulness is. And that took me into a whole other understanding of what mindfulness is. So just don't you think we're so perfect, because that picture is so beautiful. That's really us. So that's our reality. I took our kids to Disney this April, so that was us on a safari in, I can't remember, Animal Kingdom. That's where it was. Okay, so what is mindfulness? Mindfulness is just, like I said, a basic human quality. It's just a way of being. It's living in the moment, which sounds really simple and pretty obvious, but that's all it is. It's just being present to what's happening right now. Not 2 minutes ago, not 2 minutes from now, not 2 years ago, not 2 years in the forward future. Because when we do that, we end up ruminating, which all that does is leads us to a depression, or it leads us to worry about the future, which leads us to anxiety. And mindfulness is really cultivated formally through sitting meditations or various forms of meditations. But really, there are infinite daily possibilities for us to experience mindful moments, which we'll have a chance to try in a bit too. So some of the more boring stuff. Mindfulness really has ancient, ancient roots. It's about 2,500 years old. It has roots to almost all philosophical, spiritual, and psychological traditions, both Eastern and Western. It arrived in medicine in about the 1970s through John Kabat-Zinn, and I had the unique opportunity to train with John Kabat-Zinn in California, and that was an awesome experience. It was then brought to mental health actually through some work here in Toronto in the 90s, and then it moved into education in more recent years. So one of the first practices that we're going to try is what I would call a rooting exercise. So those of you that are able, I would encourage you to stand. If you are not interested in standing or not able to stand, just stay seated in your chair and try and get your feet evenly distributed onto the floor. And this is a balance challenge too. So if you are comfortable, and some of you may not be, you can close your eyes, but that's not a necessary experience. If you don't want to close your eyes, I would encourage you to just put your gaze down to the floor. And I call this rooting because I always remind my students, we are animals at our core. We belong to nature. We are part of nature. And trees connect with us because they are also part of nature. And trees are rooted and they are grounded. And so are we. And when we take notice of our feet, that makes us rooted. So what I want you to do is bring your attention down towards your feet. Can you feel your feet? Many people don't notice parts of their body throughout the day. They're so busy in their heads that they forget that they've got a body attached to that head. Do you feel your toes? Sometimes people will notice that they have like little tingling or some different sensations pulsing in your feet that you've never really taken note of before. And just notice your feet. And for very few people, our feet are always going to be with us. And when we feel stressed and very confused and anxious, try to think about this exercise. Come back to where your feet are. They root you, they ground you. They're always going to be there. And this can literally be a 10-second exercise where you turn your attention to your feet. And when you are ready, you can open your eyes and take a seat if you weren't already seated. So there's lots of really cool research happening right now in mindfulness that I would also temper by saying that there's a lot of preliminary research about mindfulness. We don't necessarily have definitive randomized controlled trials that proves beyond a shadow of a doubt in every circumstance mindfulness is of benefit. That's not where the research is at. It's still very new. Mindfulness is not new, but the research is new. So there's lots of positive structural changes that take place in our brain, sometimes even after just a few short weeks of practice. So there's literally changes in the parts of our brain that are responsible for positive social relationships, for our ability to pay attention and focus, for emotional regulation, and particularly to encourage us to be curious and to access the intuitive part of our brains. And there are telomerase changes, which is the parts of our DNA that is responsible for cell regeneration and defending against chronic diseases and that sort of thing. So I know from my work with people who have had neurological changes that things like attention span, relationships, all of that can be a challenge after you've had a brain tumor or any kind of brain injury. So for that reason, I started to notice that people were saying that this was helping them in their day-to-day life in terms of being able to focus and not be so, what their words might be, explosive with their spouse or with their kids. So that was encouraging for me. In cancer treatment, for example, people who have undergone a mindfulness training course, 65% saw improvements in their mood and a 35% reduction in stress, which is obviously a good thing, I would say. Morning blood cortisol levels, which is our stress hormone, is lower for those who meditate. And this is even after just a short few weeks of meditation. We're talking 6 weeks that you can have changes in your stress hormone levels. Fewer sick days, so your immune system might be enhanced through meditation. Notice I said might. It's not like I said we know for definitive fact all of these things are a possibility, but research is leaning us in these directions. And we can have decreases in depression and anxiety symptoms. So things like upset tummy that comes when we're anxious, elevated heart rate when we're anxious, those things have a way of fading away through mindfulness practices, which is kind of cool. So I'm going to give you an opportunity to think about how mindful you are on a daily basis. If you have a pen and piece of paper in front of you, you can record it. If you don't, you can just take a look at the questions up here. And there is a scale at the bottom. So the first question is, I find myself listening to someone with one ear, doing something else at the same time. And you can answer that by saying, 1, that's pretty much me all day. I don't listen to anybody. Or 6, that's never me. I am so focused on what the person around me is saying that this never makes sense for me. So each of these 4 questions would be answered on a scale of 1 to 6. So take a few moments to think about where you might land yourself. And this is just a sample. There's several more questions on the scale. So just by a show of hands, would you put yourself closer to the 1? Hands up. And would you put yourself closer to the 6? Oh, that was about 50-50. So like I said, mindfulness is a basic human quality. So depending on what's going on in our lives, many of us will be able to say, we're pretty mindful today or pretty mindful this year. But there will be experiences, circumstances that come in our life where mindfulness is not in our repertoire. Mindfulness is like a muscle. I always tell my patients that you can flex your muscle, you can get biceps if you want to. You can practice your muscle of what you call attention, which is basically mindfulness. So if you find yourself closer to the 1 end of this scale, you just need to start doing some mindfulness practices, and that muscle will grow. So here's a picture of a guy who's out texting on a boat, missing a whale about 3 feet from his boat. So this is the reality for a lot of us today. Our world is very busy, there's a lot going on, and we're missing a lot of things that are happening around us. Yeah, gotta give me some benefit. It's behind me, I can't see it. So he's glued to his phone and he's missing out on the world around him. And the challenge that I offer for you today is to think about what else are you missing when you are distracted, whether it's by anxieties or worries or your cell phone, things around you, your ideas, your thoughts. It could be your child smiling. It could be the sunshine. It could be the birds chirping. It's those little things that can bring quality of life in difficult times, not just a whale when we're out sailing. Now we're stuck. There we are. Does it have to be pointed in a direction? I don't know. What we're going to do is take a moment to be mindful of sounds. So when we are mindful, we're aware of things around us. There are all kinds of sounds happening no matter where we are. Those sounds might be internal, could be the gurgling of our tummies, could be a muscle creaking, it could be a hum of a light, it could be a person shuffling beside you. So just take a moment, and I'm going to be quiet, and if you could try and be still and just hear what sounds are around us right now. see if those sounds change or if your attention to a different sound is drawn. When I was packing this morning, I had said to my husband, I need raisins and a wine glass. And he said to me, I thought you said you were going to a conference. That is not what I expected you to say. So we are undertaking massive renovations at home, and my meditation bowl is, I'm not sure where. So I grabbed a wine glass. What I want you to do is listen to the sound of the wine glass, and I want you to put your hand up when you no longer hear the vibration. I do this with my kids all the time. This is a very simple mindfulness practice where you can notice sounds around you. And it takes a lot of focus, which is practicing your muscle. It's the equivalent of doing bicep curls to improve our bicep muscle. When we want to improve our attention span, really, really focus on something, and a meditation bowl or a wine glass is an option. I wonder if a battery is dying here. This is not moving. Oh, that's about 20 bumps. What's that? Yeah, thumb exercises, that's right. I use this all the time myself, just attending to our breath. What I want you to do is to put your hand on your chest and a hand on your abdomen. And all you have to notice is where you're breathing. So just take a few moments. You might want to close your eyes. I don't want you to change where you're breathing. I just want you to start to notice where you're breathing. So you'll typically feel either your hand on your chest or your hand on your abdomen more, moving more when you're breathing. Okay, so you can open your eyes if you had your eyes closed, and you can take your hands away. If you were breathing up in your upper chest versus down in your belly area, we get about 6 to 7 times more oxygen to our brains and to the other parts of our body when we breathe down into our bellies, which is a lot of oxygen. That's a big difference. And we can also, some theories are that that's how we end up having panic attacks too, is when we breathe way too shallow up here. That leads to a change in carbon dioxide and oxygen exchange in our brain, which causes panic attacks. So what I would encourage you to do throughout the day is take, 2 times a day, 1 time a day, 10 times a day, whatever works for you. Ask yourself, where am I breathing? Is it in your chest or is it in your belly? And then also ask yourself, what am I feeling? Because 9 times out of 10, what you're feeling will correlate to where you're breathing. So if you're stressed out, worried, those sorts of feelings, often you will be breathing in your chest. And what I always tell the people that I work with is, it's a real shame. You can't eliminate the true difficulties in your life, but to let them make your physical body worse because of your thoughts about them is not helpful for you. It's not healthy for you. So if you can at least attune to where you're breathing and see if you can consciously be aware of how your breath is impacting the oxygen level that's taking place in your body. One of the other things that paying attention gives us is the ability to be curious. And curious is a really important thing when we're facing a really uncertain or difficult future, or present for that matter. When we get certain about things, that's dangerous because, as most everybody in the room knows, there is nothing certain. in life, taxes, death. That's pretty much all we know for certain. We have to be curious about what's down the road, what's tomorrow, what's next week, what's next month. One of the best ways to demonstrate this to you is through what I call my raisin exercise. And so if you haven't already eaten the raisins on your table, has everybody eaten the raisins already? Oh no! Is there any extra raisins? There was one on my table if anybody wants to grab that one over there. I only need one, so I can give my box to another table. Do you want a box of raisins? You really only need 1 or 2 raisins for this, so if you've got a box, just grab one and you can pass it along to your neighbors around you. Is there anybody that still needs a raisin, looking for a raisin, wants a raisin, has no interest in a raisin? What? Yeah. I've got a wine glass. So when we get curious, there's lots of research that is linking curiosity to decreased anxiety, defensiveness, rigidity, and more enjoyment of life. And that is something that I think personally everybody could use a little bit more of. So some of you will love raisins, some of you will hate raisins, some of you will be indifferent. Only those of you that are allergic to raisins would I ask you to disengage from this exercise, but honestly, in 17 years, I've never run across anybody allergic to raisins, so if you're allergic, don't do this. If you hate raisins, that's sometimes the best exercise. So what I want you to do is imagine that you are an alien and you have landed in this room and you know nothing about anything to do with planet Earth. And somebody has put this little brown object, you don't even know that it's brown because you don't know that brown is a color on human linguistic categories. So you've got this thing in your hand and you have no idea what it is. I want you to look at it. You can point it up to a light source and you might be able to see different bumps and ridges, color changes. You can look at it in your hand, see what you notice about the raisin. Now I want you to bring it up, and I'm using the word raisin. Remember, you don't know it's a raisin. Put it to your ear. What do you hear? Bring it to your nose. What do you smell? And in a moment, I'm going to invite you to put it in your mouth, but I don't want you to bite it. But I do want you to notice the urge to bite. So place the raisin in your mouth when you're ready, and don't bite, just notice what takes place in your mouth. And you can take a bite, very slowly, and notice a second bite. And start to noticing what's taking place inside your mouth. So you might be noticing particular sensations. I want you to slowly chew, noticing every bite, every experience, every sound, every taste. And just before you feel like you want to swallow that raisin, notice that impulse to swallow, and then you can swallow it. I think we had a traveling mic as a possibility. I don't know where that is. Is there a traveling mic? Okay. Could somebody grab it maybe? If anybody is comfortable, if you could just share with us what you noticed about the raisin while you were eating it this time. Ugly, but delicious. The first time I did this, actually, I noticed that a raisin tastes like red wine. And I thought, well, heck, why haven't I been eating raisins like this a lot more?
I can honestly say I've never had a raisin last that long in my mouth.
Yeah.
I never realized there was so much in one raisin.
That's right. That's partly why we do the raisin exercise, because when you eat raisins, you usually throw 3 or 4 at a time in your mouth. You chew them super fast. You don't really pay attention to what is happening inside your mouth, and down they go, and then in go the next 3 or 4. Yeah. You love raisins. Yeah. Anyone else? Good point. Don't get too curious. Just not rigid. A little curious. So people will comment, they will notice the sense of saliva coming into their mouth, which is not usually an experience that we notice when we're eating. They might notice the sounds of chewing inside our mouth. Again, not a sensation that you would normally pay attention to. So I try to encourage people that I work with to really just notice even the first bite of every meal. Take the time to notice your food in this manner. There is something beneficial to our bodies and our minds about being curious, and being curious about our food is another interesting way to try and build that muscle of attention. Another thing that mindfulness brings us is what I call a beginner's mind. This is what Epstein calls, or has been quoted as saying, to hold what we know lightly so that you're ready for it to be different. So this is the opposite, like I said, about curiosity in terms of getting rigid about what you know to be true in the world. It helps us uncouple ourselves from past experiences or other people's past experiences. We all have our own unique experiences and journeys, and they're not going to be the same as somebody else who's had the same tumor, who's had the same medical condition, who's had the same loved one's experiences. There's no such thing as the exact same experience. It's like Dr. Toyota was saying earlier today, that individualized care is ideally the best care, and individualized way of thinking about the world is also a really unique way of approaching our life. So here's an example of a beginner's mind. This is a picture of a rose taken in my garden last fall. And my son was 7 at the time, and he said, "Mommy, you have to come over here right now." And I thought that there was something wrong. I thought like he found like a dead cat or something in the garden. And when I got over there, he said to me, "Mom, isn't this the most beautiful rose you have ever seen?" And I have to be honest, about 2.5 months before this photo was taken, I'd stopped looking at my garden, because this was November, and I know, because of cognitive rigidity, that our gardens aren't pretty in the fall. They're pretty in May and June and July and August, but after that, not as beautiful. What he was seeing here, the red dots, are frost damage on the rose. And so it was just another example for me of there's so many things around us every day that when we can leave behind the things that we know to be true about life, we can experience potentially really beautiful, wonderful things. And so my son has a beginner's mind because he doesn't have preconceived ideas and experiences to build on to help him know what a rose is supposed to look like. And so his mind was the mind that was able to pick up how pretty this rose was in November, whereas I had stopped looking at the rose garden for about 2 months because it was November, and who looks at the rose garden in November? It's depressing. So when you can try and have an understanding that we don't know, we might be able to find some really interesting and beautiful things about life. Again, something I don't need to tell anybody in this room, but cancer brings a lot of things: loss of certainty, loss of control, and constant change. And with that usually comes worry, which is depression, and anxiety, worrying about the future. So how do you potentially uninstall that from being also part of a cancer diagnosis? When we have anxiety, we often tell ourselves stories that aren't necessarily true. They're things that our minds are making up that are often just making our experiences worse. So my first advice is don't believe everything that you tell yourself, because often it's anxiety that drives our own internal talk. Our minds typically wander about 50% of the day. So I know that when I lecture my students that about 50% of the time they don't listen to me. So I usually repeat what I'm saying 3-4 times, and I know that for sure they'll hear it once. If they've missed it the previous 3, the 4th time's a charm. And we have between 12,000 and 50,000 thoughts per day, which is an enormous amount of thinking going on. And the intriguing part is about 95% of those thoughts are the exact same. So my word of advice to you is to notice what you are thinking and what you are telling yourself. Because if what you're thinking and what you're telling yourself is not helpful, if it's an anxiety-driven thought, you're making your life more miserable than it needs to be. So just simply taking note of what you're thinking and let that go. Because if we're going to repeat that thought 95% of the day, that cannot possibly be good for our well-being. One of my favorite poems that kind of gets at this idea is by Rumi, and it's called The Guesthouse. Is anybody familiar with The Guesthouse, the poem? I'll read it to you. The guest house. This being human is a guest house. Every morning a new arrival, a joy, a depression, a meanness. Some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all. Even if they are a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house, empty of its furniture, still treat each guest honorably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight. The dark thought, the shame, the malice. Meet them at the door laughing and invite them in. Be grateful for whatever comes, because each has been sent from beyond as a guide. For me, this poem tells us that anything and everything can arrive at our doorstep. Can be good, can be awful, can be in between those two extremes. The challenge for all of us is to accept whatever arrives at our door, because we have very little control of what arrives at our door. And when we try to shut out the difficult parts and only welcome in the good, we end up setting ourselves up for a real battle that's only going to end in heartbreak and problems for us. So welcome everything that comes our way is the advice from that poem, I would say. When we don't welcome everything to our door, we usually make stress a part of our life. So the stress response is a natural response that our bodies have to stress. And so we get elevated blood pressure, we get blood that flows away from our brain down to our big muscles when we're under stress. Our vision and our hearing narrow, so if we're really stressed out, we don't really notice what's happening on the periphery. We don't really hear anything else. We start to sweat. There's all kinds of other parasympathetic responses that we aren't really in control of. And that's the fight or flight response. It helps us in fight or flight situations. This has really prehistoric roots. It's very deep in our brain. It's an old part of our brain that our ancestors, it's pretty much all our ancestors had, really. So our prehistoric ancestors could be chilling out under a tree. Now, they would be unlikely to be reading a book in prehistoric times, but you get the idea. So they're chilling out, and that arrives. Ah! What's your response? Your prehistoric ancestor would have freaked out. Blood pressure would have elevated, muscles would have gotten all the blood, the big muscles in our legs. The blood would have gone away from the brain, the heart rate would have elevated, the eyes narrowed, they started to sweat, and what do you think they did? They got the hell out. Because you're not going to win against a saber-toothed tiger. So that fight or flight would instantly help them decide, can I fight this threat or do I need to get out of here? And in most cases, when they saw a real, true, life-threatening incident, they're out of there. The problem is, in modern day, this flight or flight response gives us the ability to ruminate, our ability to rethink over and over again. And as that diagram shows, our current modern brain has that big frontal cortex that gives us the ability to think over and over about the difficulties, the experiences that we're having in life. And sometimes that's really pleasurable. That's our ability to rehash beautiful memories, think about experiences that we've had in the past, but it can also lead us to ruminate, to worry about what's been or what's to come. And all this really does is cause us chronic stress, and it really doesn't help us cope in the long term. So our job is to figure out how to stop that chronic flight or fight response. And mindfulness is potentially a way for us to disengage from that fight or flight. It gives us, our brains and our bodies, an opportunity to recall that we are meant, at least for some part of our day, to be chilling out under a tree. That is biologically what we need to be ultimately well. Whereas a lot of us really are in that fight or flight in a constant state. We startle easily, we don't notice things around us as quickly, we rehash our same ideas 95% of the day. That's all a sign of a stress response. So I would encourage you now to think about and start to recognize the signs of stress in yourself. So again, if you have a piece of paper or a pen in front of you, you can start to figure out, are you burnt out or are you super resilient in your life? So if you're burnt out, you would give yourself more of a 1. You would be withdrawn. Or do you feel more present? You're not withdrawn at all. You're actively present to your life. That would give yourself a 10. Same with the next number B. Do you feel defeated? Give yourself a 1. Do you feel like you completely bounce back? That's a 10. Most people would probably scale themselves somewhere in between that. So take a look at that scale for a moment and see where you would place yourself. So again, just by the show of hands, if you feel comfortable, would you put yourself more at the 1 end of the scale versus the 10 end of the scale? So I would encourage you to think about, where do you ideally want your life to be? It's not realistic to be at a 10 100% of the day. That's not possible. However, it's also not healthy and helpful for our lives to end up feeling like you're more on the 1 end of things. Mindfulness, a meditation practice, can help us lower our heart rates, can help us decrease our blood pressure, which has the potential to disengage us from that stress feeling. So that's what we're going to do next. We're going to have a chance to sit for 5 minutes in meditation. If you don't feel comfortable, don't want to, you can just disengage for the next 5 minutes. If you are interested, I would welcome you to get yourself comfortable in your chair. And for some people, that means drawing your gaze down into the floor. If you are comfortable, I would encourage you to close your eyes and just listen to my directions. So I want us to start noticing our bodies in our chairs, the feeling of your bottom, your back, resting into the chairs, your feet rooting into the ground, relaxing into your seat. The next few minutes are just about yourself. You might be noticing some sounds around you, some bodily sensations, maybe an ache, a pain. You might be thinking about heading out shortly from the building, getting home. If you can, for the next few moments, leave behind all of those thoughts, those ideas, those sounds, and draw your attention to your breathing. And everybody is different. You may notice your breath, the rise and fall of your chest or your abdomen. Could be the coolness on the inhale, the warmth on the exhale through your nostrils. And just take a moment to notice, where are you breathing? You're not changing where you're breathing, you're just noticing your breath. That's the beautiful thing about our breath, it's always with us. And this is what we call practicing that muscle of attention. It's just noticing your breath. And it's going to be natural for things to try and distract you from our breath. That's how our minds work. It might be a sound, a thought, an idea, a feeling. One of the most interesting things is when you have an itch when you're meditating. It's very hard to not scratch. See if you can not scratch. Watch that rise and fall of that urge. And when that sound, that feeling, that idea, that thought is no longer pulling you away, come back to your breath. This is the opportunity to figure out how our bodies are meant to be, relaxed and at ease, breathing. Knowing that our breath is in the background, start to bring your attention back to your body in your chair, noticing your toes, your legs, your back, noticing what it feels like to feel that pressure on your chair. And you may want to give yourself a little wiggle before you return to open your eyes. Normally I would ask for people to comment on that experience, but I think we are pretty nigh to the end. I would just draw your attention to this quote by Viktor Frankl. If you're not familiar with Viktor Frankl, he was a famous psychologist who was a prisoner in Auschwitz. And what he noticed was that some people were able to thrive in Auschwitz and some people collapsed under the obviously incredibly stressful experience of being there. He says, between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. We are all able to make a choice about how we respond to the raindrops that arrive in our life. And I would encourage you to try and make, as best you can, a dance in between. Make that response a dance. Here are some informative videos. If anybody's interested in these slides, I'm happy to take your email and I can send them on to you. My sincere thanks. And I don't think we have any time for questions, though I would be happy to stick around if anybody has any particular questions they would like to ask me. Thank you.